Thursday news and notes with some free selections. The free plays 1-1 last week, so now 3-1 over the last 2 weeks. Won last week with Mississippi, plus the points over Auburn, and lost with TCU over Oklahoma State on your Wednesday update. Then, of course, we have the Friday update, which gets you 6, 7, perhaps even 8 free selections each and every week. 2 more free selections for you on today's. Plus, I take you through some interesting things that I've uncovered during my week of going through each of the games, and also show you how to use the Phil Steele site a little bit, as well as show you how to use some of the blogs that we have up there as well. So with that said, let's get to this week's update, and let's start off with one of those, let's start off with one of the blogs here for starters. Go to the home page, and when you go to the home page, you got our daily blogs right here. We'll start with the NFL strength of wins, pain, and losses. Now, what we do here, for every opponent you defeat, you get credit for their wins. And for every opponent that you lose to, you get credit for their losses. So you see right now at the bottom, Jets, Washington, Miami, all battling at the very bottom spot. And then when you combine them right here, San Francisco hasn't lost a game, so naturally they have 0 losses. The Patriots just lost to a team with 2 wins. So they are 18, or with 2 losses, I should say. So they're 18-2. Saints are an outstanding 30-3. If you look up top here, under the strength of wins, the Saints and Green Bay have beat the teams that have the most wins so far this year. Kansas City's up there, as you would expect. Houston is up there. Baltimore, San Francisco. How about the Colts with 20 wins? Even Carolina at 19. The Patriots still down here, just 18 wins of their opponents that they've beaten so far this year. And at the very bottom, well, Miami beat a team that had 1 win now. Washington got a win. Last week's opponent, the Jets, have a win, and then Washington beat Miami, so they picked up a win this week. Both move off of the win list at the bottom. Only the Cincinnati Bengals remain with a 0 at the bottom, and at the very top, it's San Francisco, New Orleans, New England, Seattle, and Green Bay, and these teams, as you would expect, at the very bottom. I find it very interesting. Then, if you go under NFL info here, you can pick up on the NFL offense and defense YPG. Now, this is how you do against your opponent averages. And as you can tell at the top, the 49ers still number 1 up there, plus 125 yards over their averages. They're holding their opponents to 104 yards per game below their season average. Let's go take a look at that. Look at the NFL team pages. Let's go to the San Francisco 49ers right here and look at their defense. Yeah, defense doing pretty good, but look at these below the averages. They held Cleveland to 190 yards below their season average. The Rams to 260 below. Adds it all up down here, 104, number 1 in the NFL. Look who's number 2, the Saints, but they're at 63. That's 41 yards per game behind. That's a pretty large gap there. So teams at the top, as you would expect, San Francisco, New Orleans, New England, Dallas. How about the Rams? Keep talking about them. I think they're going to sneak up as the season rolls on. And we remember a couple weeks ago we put them out at 30-1 to win the Super Bowl. I think they're going to have themselves a good finish to the season. At the very bottom, the teams you wouldn't expect to be down there, maybe a Chicago, which is actually minus 59 yards per game below their opponent's average. We point that out every week, and let's see how the Bears have been doing. Click on the Bears, and they have been losing. So we've been pointing it out pretty much for the last 4 weeks, and they've lost all 4 games. So keep an eye on that. They're still near the bottom in the average. Detroit's at the bottom despite a decent record. Pittsburgh, Buffalo, minus 18 yards per game below their opponent averages despite their fine record this year. And how about the Green Bay Packers? Green Bay's down here at minus 13 yards per game above with their averages. And their defense has sort of been slipping lately. If you look at Green Bay's defense here, click on the Packers and go to their defense. They had started out the season pretty good. Look at that. They were actually holding opponents to below their season average, minus 156, minus 17, minus 91. They are below now, so keep your eyes on that. Maybe a little on the overrated side for Green Bay. All right, let's take a look at the college. Same things, strength of wins and the averages, and we're going to head over to the FBS, and we will click on the strength of wins. And at the very top is actually Ohio State. Now, keep in mind, we deduct FCS wins. So if you beat a team that's got 5 wins, but one of them was against an FCS opponent, you only get credit for 4 wins. But everybody talks about Ohio State's schedule. They're number 1 at the top with 36. Penn State's got 31. LSU with 30. Oregon with 26. Auburn's up there with 26, despite the fact they've lost 2 games, only have 7 wins this year. Clemson at 25. Memphis, Michigan is up there at 25. They, like Auburn, have 2 losses, but they're right at the top for the teams that they've beaten. Even more wins than what Georgia has on the season. Minnesota at 23, Utah 23, Cincinnati 23. Here is your losses, and then when you combine them together, here's the teams that remain unbeaten: Ohio State, Penn State, LSU, Clemson. Cincinnati has a loss, but it was to Ohio State, so it counts as 0 losses because the Buckeyes don't have a loss. Minnesota, Alabama, and Baylor. And all these teams, these 3 teams have 1 loss. Navy 18-1 up there. And how about Florida? 21-1. The 2 teams they've lost to have combined for just 1 loss all year. And we go down here. These teams count for 0 wins, even though they've got wins. The only teams that don't have a win this year are Rice, New Mexico State, and Akron. UMass has a win, but it was over Akron. Old Dominion has not beat a team that has got a FBS win this year. UTEP has not defeated a team. And the surprising one I'm going to point out here would be FIU and Florida Atlantic. Yeah, I guess we'll get to that on the Friday tape. Let's continue on here, and we will go to the averages for college football now. And here it is. Take a look. Now, I haven't even looked at this one, so you and I are both going to be looking at the same time together. Ohio State's number 1. They are averaging 358 yards combined, offense and defense, over what their opponents allow. Clemson. Oh, that Clemson team, that's number 5 in the college football playoff, and the one everybody says is having such a horrific season this year. Guess what? 305 yards above their opponent averages, number 2 in the country. Wisconsin's still up there, even though they've lost a couple of games. Oklahoma, even though they lost to Kansas State, still up there at number 4. LSU at 5, Bama at 6, Georgia 7. Utah's been very impressive. Look at this, 160 yards per game on defense. They're number 8. Iowa State, they've got 2 or 3 losses this year. They're at plus 192, so that's interesting. They're playing Oklahoma. We'll have to keep an eye on that game this week. Navy's up there at 165. Michigan's got 2 losses, but they're up here at number 11, 164.8, even ahead of Penn State at 162.1. So that's pretty interesting. Who's at the bottom? Let's take a look if there's anybody down here at the bottom that you wouldn't expect. All these teams pretty much, yes, you expect these teams. I don't see anyone. Illinois is down here. Now, Illinois is competing for a bowl spot right now, but they are minus 84 yards per game, below what their opponents normally allow for the year. So all that's very interesting. It's all at your fingertips every week. And also, by the way, here on philsteele.com, you can get pass efficiency defense updated. You know how we have it in the magazine. This takes into account their opponents. So it's not just your completion percentage, your yards, your touchdowns, your interceptions, but it takes into account who you took on as well. So like Utah, for example, they're allowing 56% with a 10-11 ratio. These numbers are a little better for Oregon, but they've taken on tougher opponents, so that's why Utah is here and Oregon is here. So it's very interesting. You've got your pass defense ratings. Wisconsin still comes in 1, Utah 2, Oregon 3, Ohio State 4, Clemson 5, Pitt 6. TCU is up here at number 7. UCF is 8, Alabama 9, LSU 21. These 2 defenses definitely going to be tested. Alabama's number 9 pass D. LSU's number 21 pass D, definitely going to be tested. Who's got the weakest pass Ds? All these teams you'd pretty much expect to be down here. Boston College, surprisingly, down here at number 119. They've got themselves a winning record this year. UCLA's down here at number 118. So do keep that in mind. This is available. And we also have, I believe we also have special teams rankings up here for you. Click on special teams. These are updated through November the 5th. Right now, LSU's got the best special teams in the country. So keep that in mind for their big matchup with Alabama this week. Let's find out. Oh, Alabama's number 4. So we got 2 excellent special teams units taking on each other this week. Who's got the weakest special teams? Well, Tulsa. They're actually outgaining a lot of the foes they're losing to, but look at this, number 129 in special teams. Northwestern, you would never expect a Pat Fitzgerald team to be down here at number 123 in the special teams rankings, and maybe this is part of the reason TCU's down here, number 114 this year. That's highly unusual for them. Usually they get a lot of solid return game going for them. A couple other notes for you. Do you know the last time that an Ohio State coach actually won the Big Ten Coach of the Year? I'll take you back to it. It's been quite some time. Ohio State comes into the season with high expectations every year. I'm going to click on the last 40 years' results. This gets you the spread records. And remember, I point this out every week. If you look at the last 40 years' results, you get the totals on every game dating back to 2003. They didn't really have a lot of totals here. It was just on the maybe 7 or 8 TV games for the week. They finally started putting totals on every game back in 2003. We started charting them here. And also you get these halftimes. Look at the halftime scores of each of the games, which we started right here in 2004 for every team. And it's available for every team, not just Ohio State, not just the Power 5, but every team that's been playing football. In fact, we can go to, as an example, one of the MAC teams right now. And if you go to the MAC and take a team like Ohio U, for example, we can click on their last 40 years results. And you see we'd go back to 1988 on them. And here is their halftimes on all the games as well as their over-unders. So do keep that in mind. Now let's go back to Ohio State now because I want to point out something to you. Let's guess the last time that they had a coach that won Coach of the Year. Now, they've had some pretty good records. And if you look down here, you can see some very good records for Ohio State through the years. I'm going to take this back. Tell me when to stop. Tell me when to stop. We're back to 2006, 5, 4, 3, 2. How about 2000? How about the 1990s, 1980s? Right here, 1979 was the last time an Ohio State coach won the Big Ten Coach of the Year. I bring that up because right now my number one candidate is Ryan Day. And ironically, back in 1979, it was the same circumstance. Here's the Clemson game where Woody Hayes punched the Clemson player and got fired. Now, replacing a legend, it was Earl Bruce. First year on the job. And guess what? They went undefeated. They go to the Rose Bowl, nearly won a national championship. The votes taken prior to the Rose Bowl, Earl Bruce was Coach of the Year because nobody expected Ohio State to contend for the title. They weren't even picked to win the Big Ten that year. They were coming off a season where they had just lost to Clemson in the bowl, lost to Michigan, and they had lost their Hall of Fame head coach. And yet Earl Bruce did miraculous that year. They ran the table, got to the Rose Bowl, and nearly won it all. Same circumstance to Ryan Day, and that's why I've got him number one. You look at Ohio State last year, and if you go through their season last year, they were a team that struggled. The TCU game only won by 12, and there was a couple of big plays. They scored like 3 touchdowns in a 2-minute span in that game. Penn State, they barely got past that one. They pulled it out 27-26. Ohio State getting a 24-yard TD pass with 2 minutes left, or they would have lost at Penn State. The Indiana game only led 28-20 at the half, gave up 317 yards in the first half. Minnesota was 17-14 in the third quarter. Purdue was 17-14 at the half, and they got blown out 49-20. Nebraska, they barely got passed by 5, and Nebraska only won 4 games last year. The Michigan State game, the MVP of that game was their punter, Drew Chrisman, because he punted and pinned Michigan State inside their 10-yard line almost the entire game. The yards weren't dominant, but that's how Ohio State was getting the bulk of their scores. The Maryland game, Maryland missed a 2-point conversion or would have beat them. So Ohio State struggled last year. They lose a Hall of Fame coach. They had a defense that was bad. They gave up 403 yards per game last year. They only have 1 offensive lineman returning. They lose their quarterback who threw 49 touchdown passes, and yet Ryan Day's got this going on. Perfection. And everybody's calling Ohio State the most complete team in college football, but there's another team that's all green like this. And it's one that's not getting any respect at all this year. And it's the Clemson Tigers. Look at Clemson compared to Ohio State. These teams have all green. Green are good numbers, red are bad. And I know by looking at these two teams, you're like, I don't even know if you have red numbers. Yeah, believe it or not, we got red numbers. Let's take a team that's struggling. Let's take a look at Rutgers, for example. See if they've got any red numbers going on for them. Click on them. There's your red numbers. Bad rush defense, bad rush offense, a lot of losses. So as you can see, there's plenty of red out there. We can even take a team like Alabama, and they've got some red here. 459 yards they allowed to South Carolina. Only ran the ball for 76 yards against South Carolina. 476 to Ole Miss. They gave up 279 yards on the ground. 324 in the air through South Carolina. So they've got some red marks on their record. How about LSU? Do they have any red marks on their record? And we go to LSU. Yes, they do. 530 yards, 409 passing to Texas, 457 to Florida, 311, 86 yards rushing against Mississippi State. They've got some red marks going on there. Yet, everybody says Clemson is the team that is really struggling this year, and Clemson has had one bad game. North Carolina barely got past North Carolina 21-20, outgained them by 41 yards. But the committee just put Penn State ahead of them. Let's go take a look at Penn State for a second. Now, Penn State's unbeaten, right? So is Clemson. Has Penn State had any close games? Well, damn straight they have. Look at this. They were trailing Buffalo at the half, 10-7. They were outgained 270-82. They had some special teams, some turnovers for the game. They were out first down 22-14 by Buffalo. If you look at the final score, you say, wow, Penn State dominated the game, but it wasn't like that at all. The Pittsburgh game, they won by 7. Coach Narduzzi, down by 7, opted for a field goal from the 1-yard line. They missed the field goal, ended up losing by 7. Some question that decision. I understand it. I understand why he went for it. But as you could tell, that was an extremely close game. Penn State got out first down 20-17. Iowa, they were outgained 356-294. In fact, in the first half, Penn State, Iowa had 3 trips in the red zone. Penn State had 1. Iowa settled for 2 field goals and missed a field goal, and that's why they were down 7-6 at the half, where Penn State led 7-6. Penn State won by 5. And then against Michigan drops a touchdown pass at the end. I think if they would have caught that touchdown pass and forced overtime, as you can tell here, Michigan was dominating, 26-14 first down edge. And even Michigan State has played, let's face it, they played like crap this year. And yet, Penn State only outgained them by 37 yards in that game. So for all the talk that, Clemson is struggling this year, nope, 52-14. Texas A&M scored a touchdown with 3 seconds left. In fact, A&M had under 200 yards offense until this final drive of the game where they scored a touchdown with 6 seconds left. To make it 24-10. They didn't struggle there. They dominated. Syracuse dominated. Charlotte dominated. Florida State, that thing was 42-0 in the third quarter. Click back here, 42-0. And Clemson's problem, and it's not really a bad problem because they've only not covered twice against FBS teams this year, is that they play about 110 players. And so they've got walk-ons on the field in the fourth quarter, yet they're still covering 45-10, 59-7. They held a very good Boston College offense to 177 yards. And then Wofford last week, 42-0 at the half. A lot of backups saw action. And so this is a Clemson team that gets knocked for a lot of reasons, and I'm still scratching my head. If you take a big game, we could take a look at Justin Fields, how he did against Wisconsin last week. Fields, let's click on Ohio State for a second here. 12 of 22 for 167 yards. He did run for some, threw for a little bit. Trevor Lawrence is still would be the number 1 quarterback if he came out right now. And he hasn't thrown. Let's go click on the individual stats. He threw some interceptions early. Trevor Lawrence hasn't thrown an interception in the last 2 games. I think you're going to see this Clemson team be pretty angry with being number 5 in the playoff committee poll. They've got Travis Etienne at running back. They've got a defense that's number 1 in the country, holding opponents to 164 yards below their season average. Ohio State's close. They're number 3 at 169. And over here, you've got Ohio State's number 1 on offense. They're number 7 on offense. So Clemson is a complete team. Not really sure why everybody's knocking them. And people are saying they're not playing well this year. The only game they didn't play well was North Carolina. Sorry, guys. Every other game they've dominated. And that's a nice segue to our first selection, because we are going to go right with this Clemson team this week. Got to be an angry Clemson team. Fifth in the playoff committee. Unbelievable. And they're taking on NC State this week. Now, let's go click on NC State and see what they got going on. Now, NC State had some high hopes coming into the year, but they've struggled at quarterback. At the beginning of the year, it was Matthew McKay. Then they went to Hockman. Last week, they went to Devin Leary at QB. Let's see how Devin Leary did. 17 of 45 for 149 yards. They played a Wake Forest defense that, let's go take a look at Wake Forest defense, because I'm curious. I didn't look that up individually to see. Wake this year is allowing opponents 23 yards above their season average, number 88 in the country, giving up 400 yards per game. That's what Leary faced last week. This week, Leary is going against Clemson's defense. Now, here's another thing that I like, and it happens with Alabama, and it happens with a lot of your power teams. When they are a road favorite, I like those teams as a road favorite. Why is that? Clemson cannot play 110 players here. Why? Because you only can travel so many in a conference game. So they can only get down to their second and third string in this. They're not down to their fifth string walk-on or sixth string walk-on at the end of the game. That's another nice advantage and a reason that they do cover so well on the road. You look at the Syracuse game, they won by 35. The Louisville game, they won by 35. This is an NC State team that struggled against Wake, only 265 yards last week. They only had 366 yards against Boston College's defense. That's 131 below season average. You're gaining 60 yards less than what their opponents come in allowing. Well, Clemson allows 247, so if that happens, they get 187 yards here. And let's do the flip side. Clemson's defense holds opponents to 164 yards below their season average. They're averaging 396. That'd be about 230. You're looking at about 200 yards offense for NC State. Meanwhile, on the flip side of the coin, well, NC State's got some players on D. They can play defense. Look here. They had 16 sacks against Florida State and Syracuse. Only 2 the last 2 weeks, and they are giving up, only holding opponents to 19 yards below their season average. Clemson's got 107 above. They're averaging 545 yards per game. Do you try to stop Etienne, or do you try to stop Lawrence or Higgins or Ross or Rogers or that outstanding offensive line, which is only giving up 6 sacks? It's an angry Clemson team and away favorite. And how about this? You know, some of those other teams struggle a lot against the spread. Clemson is 15-3-1 against the spread their last 19 games against FBS teams. So add it all up here, you got a number 5 in the playoff committee. And granted, that means nothing. If Clemson runs the table, they're in the playoff. We all know that. And they will run the table. They'll beat NC State, Wake Forest, South Carolina. They'll win the ACC title game against whatever the Coastal throws out there. But they just have to be a little angry this week. And they're only laying 31.5. It's almost more comfortable laying 31.5 on the road than it is 31.5 at home, because you can't get down to that 111th player on the team like they did against Charlotte. So add it all up, your first official play this week, we are going to go with Clemson minus the 31.5 over NC State. All right, let's get to your second official play. Well, before I get to it, one other quick note I want to mention. And this is another big game we're going to talk about, Penn State. And the only thing I want to point out here is that let's go and take a look at their Big Ten action. Or not Penn State, Minnesota, I should say. Let's go to Minnesota and take a look at their Big Ten action. They are playing Penn State, so let's go ahead and throw Penn State up here as well, just so we got something to compare them to. With Minnesota, their Big Ten foes this year, Purdue. What happened in that game? Purdue lost their starting quarterback and their All-American wide receiver in the first quarter on the same play. So they basically took on a backup quarterback the rest of the game in Jack Plummer. Jack Plummer ran 8 times for 29 yards. Plummer hit 23 of 41 for 245 yards. Minnesota rolled. Okay, the next week they take on Illinois. Well, guess what? There's only one game this year that Illinois' quarterback has missed. And that game happened to be Minnesota. If you take a look at Illinois this year, take on their individual stats, Brandon Peters been their quarterback all year. He missed the Minnesota game. He got injured in the first quarter. Sorry about that. 5 of 10. He missed the Michigan game, but he got injured early against Minnesota. 5 of 10 for 32 yards. It was Matt Robinson most of the game. 15 of 29. Then the next game was Nebraska. Nebraska did not have their quarterback, and let's go just double check because I take one quick here. Adrian Martinez against Minnesota did not play. It was Noah Vertel, and he had 14 of 23 for 135 yards. The Rutgers game, Rutgers down to their third string quarterback at that time. And Maryland last week, Maryland did not have their starting quarterback for the game. So, well, you can also come down here and just click on the box score and see who the quarterback was. They started Pegram in this game. Once again, Pegram got injured. Now, Josh Jackson was back off an injury, but he only attempted 2 passes and wasn't looking good. So there was Tyler DeSue, who was the quarterback for the entire second half. He had 4 of 12 for 88 yards. So they've got pretty good fortune. 3 times the starting quarterback got knocked out. The other 2 times they took on a backup quarterback. And this week the quarterback they're taking on, we're going to click on Penn State and take a look at them. Penn State's quarterback, Sean Clifford, hitting 62%, 20 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. First, if he plays the entire game, that'll be a big thing, and I think it's probably a big enough advantage for Penn State here. I like Penn State's defense, giving up 100 or holding opponents to 88 yards per game, below their season average. Now, Minnesota's is doing the same thing, but as mentioned, Minnesota's been playing a lot of backup quarterbacks so far this year. So I just thought I'd point that out to you. Not a selection. That is not a selection. The only one so far is Clemson, minus the points over NC State. And we'll get to your final thing for your Wednesday news and notes tape. We're going to take a look at the Byu and Liberty game. Now, if you look at this game on paper and statistically, you can say, hey, Liberty's got a really good shot here. I mean, let's face it, on the season, Liberty is plus 25 yards per game. BYU is minus 7 yards per game. Liberty's outscoring their opponents by 8 points per game. BYU's being outscored by 2 points per game. Liberty's got the better record. They come in at 6-3. BYU comes in at 4-5. You're probably asking yourself right now, looking just at those records and those stats, why is BYU a 17-point favorite? Well, let's take a little closer examination. BYU's a decent team. I like BYU this year. And these teams they've been beaten, they were an underdog to Tennessee, an underdog to USC, an underdog to Boise State, an underdog to Utah State. They were also an underdog to Washington. They were an underdog to Utah. So they were an underdog in every game but 2 this year. They are a much better team than their record. They were the only team in the country in the month of September that played 4 Power 5 teams. The only team that in their first 4 games played 4 Power 5 teams. Now, let's see how BYU compares to what's Liberty's played this year. Liberty played Syracuse, probably the weakest team in the ACC this year, and lost by 24. Liberty played Louisiana, a bowl team, but a Sun Belt bowl team, and they lost by 21. Liberty played Buffalo and beat them by 18. They were also in a good situation against Buffalo, catching off a big win. They played Hampton, and Hampton's not BYU. They played New Mexico, not BYU. New Mexico State, not BYU. Maine, not BYU. Rutgers, they lost to Rutgers by 10, probably the weakest team in the Big Ten this year, and they beat UMass. Out of all their opponents, BYU's the toughest one they will have faced this year. Now let's go look at the BYU situation. Utah, Tennessee, USC, Washington, Toledo, USF, Boise, and Utah State. All 8 of these foes would be favored over Liberty. So Liberty's taken on their toughest opponent of the season. BYU's taken on their weakest opponent of the season. So throw the stats in the trash. We got ourselves a BYU team that's much better battle-tested, and they're the much better team in this situation. Now, the other thing that I found intriguing is generally when you're taking on such a weak schedule like Liberty is, well, naturally you're going to have better numbers than what their opponents come in averaging, or opponents average on the season. Interesting for Liberty, they're minus 17 yards per game against this schedule. So their opponents actually hold them to 17 yards below what they normally allow, and they've played a bunch of weak foes. They also hold their opponents, or they allow their opponents 26 yards above their season average, and they're playing weak foes. So I find these 2 numbers here really threw me a little bit, made this into an official pick. BYU minus 17 over Liberty. BYU needs 2 more wins to get to a bowl. Nothing is guaranteed. They should get there. Liberty, Idaho State, UMass, that should get them at least to 7, and then we'll see how the San Diego State game goes. But I like the way they're playing. Now, last week, Jaron Hall started. And he was got a concussion, so Romney replaced him. Romney actually did well in the second half. It was 21-14 at the half. They won the second half 21-0 with Romney at quarterback. So I feel okay if he is the quarterback this week. He led them to a 21-0 over Utah State last week. So I think that situation is okay. And I just think that you're looking at a BYU team that, has got the weaker record coming in. They're not as good statistically, but they have played they're taking on their weakest opponent, and they're taking on their toughest. Well, I'll be getting notes the next couple of days, getting them all ready for the Friday Phil Steele Plus tour with probably have 7-8 selections as usual. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch the Wednesday news and notes. Once again, your 2 free plays today. Clemson minus the points over NC State. BYU minus the points over Liberty. And I'll be back with you on Friday with the Phil Steele Plus tour with selections.